Never thought a text from my next-door neighbor would be the thing that unraveled 6 months of my life. Her message came in at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning while I was sitting in the break room at the hospital in Raleigh, eating a granola bar between a double shift. She wrote, "Hey, just wanted to check. Did you rent out your place? There were people on your back porch last night having drinks. I figured you knew, but then I remembered you said you'd be gone all summer." I read it 3 times before I fully understood what she was saying. My name is Scott Harmon. I'm 51 years old, and I've been a traveling contractor in commercial HVAC for going on 14 years. The work takes me to job sites across the Southeast, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months at a stretch. I own a house in Greensboro, North Carolina, a 3-bedroom Craftsman I bought 9 years ago, the first real thing I ever owned after my divorce. It's nothing fancy. Hardwood floors, a small deck out back, a garden I only half maintain because I'm never home long enough to do it right, but it's mine, and I love it the way you love something you worked genuinely hard for. That summer, I was on a 7-month contract at a hospital construction project in Raleigh, about 90 minutes from home. Close enough that I drove back once a month or so, but far enough that the house sat empty most of the time. I had a guy I trusted, a handyman named Victor who'd done repairs for me for years, who held a spare key and would check on things occasionally. Water the few plants on the porch, make sure nothing was leaking, that kind of thing. I paid him a flat rate every month. We had a handshake arrangement and I never thought twice about it. I stared at my neighbor's text and felt the granola bar turn to concrete in my stomach. I called her back immediately. She answered on the second ring, and her voice had that careful tone people use when they're not sure how to deliver news. She told me she'd seen lights on in my house several times over the past few weeks. She'd seen a car in my driveway she didn't recognize. The night before, she'd watched 2 people, a man and a woman, sit on my back deck until almost midnight. She'd assumed I knew. She felt bad for not saying something sooner. I told her I had no idea, that nobody had permission to be there. There was a pause. "Oh," she said quietly. "Oh, Scott." I hung up and sat there for a minute just staring at the floor. My first instinct was to drive straight home, walk in the front door, and demand to know what was going on. But I'd been doing this work long enough to know that acting on first instinct in an unknown situation is almost never the right call. I didn't know what I was walking into. I didn't know who was in my house, how many of them there were, whether they were dangerous. And if someone was going to claim they had a right to be there, I wanted to have evidence that proved otherwise before any confrontation happened. So I called the Greensboro Police non-emergency line instead. The officer I spoke with was patient and heard me out, but his answer was more or less what I feared. Without evidence of forced entry, without a lease dispute or a formal complaint, there wasn't much they could do on the spot. If someone was in the house claiming they had permission, it became a civil matter until I could prove otherwise. He recommended I document everything I could before making any moves, get security cameras if possible, establish a paper trail. I thanked him and hung up. He was right, even though it made me want to put my fist through the wall. I drove to a Best Buy on my lunch break and bought 3 wireless indoor cameras and a video doorbell, the kind that push footage to the cloud automatically, so even if someone found and removed the cameras, the footage would already be saved. I also picked up a cheap Android tablet to use as a dedicated monitor. That evening, I drove the 90 minutes to Greensboro. I parked on a street 2 blocks over and walked to my house from the back, coming through the alley that runs behind the properties on my street. The house looked normal from the outside. Porch light on, curtains drawn. I came in through the back door using my key, moving quietly even though that struck me as absurd. It was my own house. The smell hit me first. Someone else's cooking. Garlic and something herby. Not unpleasant, but completely foreign. Not mine. I stood in my kitchen doorway and took stock. There was a set of dishes in the drying rack that I didn't own. A coffee maker on my counter. I have a French press. I've had the same French press for 11 years. A bag of some premium coffee brand sitting next to it. There was a half-eaten bag of tortilla chips on the kitchen table with a jar of salsa. On the counter, a set of keys I didn't recognize on a key ring with a small Eiffel Tower charm. I walked through the whole house like I was surveying a crime scene, which, I was starting to understand, was exactly what I was doing. The living room had a throw blanket on my couch that wasn't mine. A phone charger plugged into the outlet behind the TV. The spare bedroom, which I use as a home office, had a suitcase open on the floor, partially unpacked, men's clothes, a toiletry bag, a laptop charging on the desk. My desk. I felt a cold, specific rage that I've only felt a handful of times in my life. This wasn't a break-in. This was somebody living here, comfortably, using my house like a hotel. I set up the cameras quickly, working from memory of where I'd planned to place them on the drive over. One on the bookshelf in the living room with a clear angle on the front door and the main room. One in the kitchen, above the cabinets where it would be invisible from below. One in the hallway between the bedrooms. Doorbell camera outside, pointed at the front approach. I connected everything to my phone and the tablet, checked the feeds, and left the way I came. I didn't touch anything, didn't move the suitcase, didn't throw out the foreign coffee maker. I wanted whoever this was to come back and have no idea I'd been there. I drove back to Raleigh at 11 at night with my hands tight on the wheel. The first alert came the next morning at 9:43. The doorbell camera caught a man approaching the front door. He was maybe mid-40s, decent shape, wearing dark jeans and a fleece pullover. He had a key. He let himself in the same way I had, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I watched him through the kitchen camera as he made coffee. My coffee maker, the French press, was gone, I realized. He'd replaced it. He moved through my kitchen with complete familiarity, opening cabinets he clearly knew the layout of, pouring himself a cup, sitting down at my kitchen table with his laptop. Working. He was working. In my house, at my table. Over the next 4 days, I documented everything. I watched the feeds in stolen moments during breaks at the job site, pulling out my tablet between measurements and meetings. The man, I still didn't know his name, followed a consistent routine. He was there most of the day, working on his laptop. In the evenings, he'd cook or order delivery. He never used the master bedroom. He slept in the guest room, which I'll admit I found slightly less infuriating, though only marginally. On the third day, a woman arrived. She knocked, which caught my attention because the man had a key, but she clearly didn't. He let her in, and they greeted each other with the easy familiarity of colleagues. She was carrying a tote bag and what looked like a folder of printed papers. They sat at my dining room table, where I've eaten probably 1,000 meals over 9 years, and spread out documents between them. I couldn't read anything at that resolution, but I could see it was paperwork. Contracts, maybe. Something with a logo on the header. I took screenshots of everything I could. The breakthrough came on the 5th day. The man had left his laptop open on the kitchen table while he stepped out, and the kitchen camera caught a corner of the screen. I zoomed in as far as the image quality would allow. It was a spreadsheet. I could make out column headers, dates, dollar amounts, a column that looked like it said guests or gusts. I couldn't be sure. But the numbers were there, figures in the hundreds per row. That's when I opened my laptop and searched my home address on Airbnb. It was there, my house, my living room, my backyard deck where my neighbor had watched strangers drink on a Tuesday night, listed as charming craftsman home, perfect for extended stays. The photos were my house, my furniture, my floors, the porch I built with a contractor friend 3 summers ago. The listed nightly rate was $180. There were 11 reviews, all 5 stars. The oldest review was dated about 5 months back. 5 months. I'd been on this job contract for 6 months, and they had apparently started within the first 4 weeks of me leaving. One review said, "Great location, very quiet neighborhood. Host was super responsive about early check-in." Another, "Felt completely at home. Highly recommend." Host. Someone was being called the host of my property. My hands were shaking when I closed the laptop. I went back through every piece of footage I had and started paying closer attention to the paperwork session from day 3. On one screenshot, I'd captured the woman setting a document down on the table. There was a name at the top. I enhanced it as much as I could in a basic photo editor. Trent Holloway, Property Co. Not a full business name, but enough. I searched it. Trent Holloway, Greensboro, NC, Property Management. He had a LinkedIn profile, a website that described him as a short-term rental consultant and property optimization specialist. His photo matched the man in my kitchen. The woman was harder to identify, but 2 days later I caught her name when she and Trent said goodbye at the front door, and the doorbell camera picked up their conversation clearly. "Thanks, Beverly. Same time Thursday." She nodded and walked to a car parked across the street. I ran her first name in her vehicle and eventually found a local marketing consultant named Beverly Chow who had a portfolio on her website that included rental listing photography and copywriting for Airbnb hosts. She was the one who'd taken those photos of my house, written that description, built the listing that had been renting out my home for 5 months while I worked 90 minutes away. But there was still the piece that bothered me most. How did Trent get in? Who gave him a key? I went back through the oldest footage from the doorbell camera. I'd set the sensitivity to capture everything within range and found it on the second day of recording. An older man, maybe late 50s, came to the door mid-morning. He and Trent spoke on the porch for about 4 minutes. When he left, Trent watched him go and then closed the door. The man had come on foot, which meant he was local. He was wearing a grey jacket. I could see something on the chest, a logo of some kind. Small, embroidered. I enhanced the screenshot until it was barely usable and stared at it for a long time. It was a house outline and a wrench. Simple, clean design. I searched combinations of those elements, Greensboro, home repair, maintenance logo, until I found it. Piedmont Home Services, a local handyman and property maintenance company. I pulled up their website and scrolled through the staff page until I found a photo that matched the man on my porch. His name was listed as Harold Briggs, maintenance coordinator. Victor, the handyman I'd been paying for 3 years to check on my house, worked for Piedmont Home Services. I sat with that for a while. Not the shock of it exactly, but the specific weight of it. Victor had been in my house many times. He knew the layout, knew my schedule, knew that I'd be gone the entire summer. He had a key I'd given him myself. He could have walked Trent Holloway through my house, handed over that key, explained exactly when I'd be home and when I wouldn't. He'd probably done it within weeks of me leaving for Raleigh. And for 5 months, I'd been sending him his monthly check without a second thought. I called my neighbor back. I told her what I'd found. I asked her if she'd ever seen the older man. I described Harold, coming or going from my property. She thought about it for a moment and said yes, actually. She'd seen a man fitting that description at my back door once, about a week after I'd left for the contract. She'd thought it was me at first, then realized it wasn't. I went to the Greensboro Police Department in person the next day. I asked for whoever handled property crime and fraud cases and sat down with a detective named Patricia Osei, a woman in her early 40s who listened to my entire story without interrupting and then spent about 20 minutes going through my tablet footage with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely interested in the case. "Mr. Harmon," she said when she was done, "this is organized fraud, breaking and entering, theft of services, and depending on how they've been representing ownership of the property to guests, potentially wire fraud." She looked at the footage again. "You've done good work documenting this." I told her about Harold and his connection to Victor. I told her I suspected there might be other properties involved. Trent's LinkedIn had described him as managing a portfolio of short-term rental properties, and Beverly's website listed multiple client listings in the Greensboro area. Detective Osei took down everything and told me not to confront anyone or change the locks yet. She wanted to investigate first, build the case properly before anyone knew they were being watched. I understood. I drove back to Raleigh and went back to work and did my best not to think about the stranger sleeping in my guest room every night. Over the next 2 weeks, Detective Osei and her team moved quietly. They identified Harold Briggs through Victor's employment records and brought Victor in for questioning. He broke faster than I expected. According to what the detective told me later, Trent had approached Victor about 8 months prior, before I'd even left for the Raleigh contract. He'd been targeting properties owned by people who traveled frequently for work. He'd found them partly through public records, partly through word of mouth in the trades. Victor had identified my house as a candidate, handed over a key, and provided my contact schedule. In exchange, he'd been getting a flat monthly payment, not a percentage, a flat fee of $400 a month, which tells you something about how much Trent thought of him. Victor had made $2,400 total. Trent's operation across multiple properties had grossed somewhere north of $60,000. Beverly had been running the digital side of things, the listings, the photography, the guest communication, the reviews. She wasn't present at the properties. She managed everything remotely and took a 15% cut of each booking. Trent handled the physical operations, key exchanges with guests, check-ins, maintenance issues, complaints. My house had been booked for a total of 49 nights across 5 months. At an average rate of $189, that was over $9,000 earned from my property, my utilities, my furniture, my space, the guests, and there were many of them, ranging from business travelers to a family from Ohio who'd come down for a wedding, had no idea. They'd booked what they believed was a legitimate listing from a responsive host. They'd left 5-star reviews. They'd slept in my guest room, cooked in my kitchen, sat on my deck and watched the sun go down over my neighbor's fence. The sting happened on a Saturday morning in late August. Detective Osei coordinated it for a day when a new guest was scheduled to check in, a couple from Virginia, booked for a long weekend. When Trent arrived to do the key handoff and walked up to my front door, 3 officers were waiting. Beverly was picked up at her apartment about 20 minutes later. Harold was brought in from a job site by 2 uniformed officers. Victor turned himself in with a lawyer. I was there. I stood across the street and watched Trent Holloway get handcuffed on my porch. I'm not proud of how much satisfaction that gave me, but I'm not going to pretend it wasn't there. The charges against Trent were significant: breaking and entering, felony fraud over $5,000, theft of services, conspiracy. Beverly faced fraud and conspiracy charges. Harold was charged with breach of trust and aiding and entering. Victor got the lightest treatment for his cooperation, but he still faced criminal charges and ultimately a permanent record. The couple from Virginia were mortified. Detective Osei had contacted them in advance and briefed them on what was happening. They hadn't known. The detective told me that most of the guests, when contacted, were genuinely horrified. One of them, a businessman from Charlotte who'd stayed 3 nights in April, called me directly after getting the police notification. He wanted to apologize, he said, even though he'd done nothing wrong. I told him that. I told him none of the guests had done anything wrong. The trial was 8 months later. I testified for about 2 hours, walking the jury through the camera footage, the Airbnb listing, the financial records the prosecution had subpoenaed. Trent's defense tried to argue that the house had been left unattended and unlocked, false, provably, and that his clients had no reason to believe they were booking anything other than a legitimate rental. The judge instructed the jury carefully on property law. They deliberated for less than a day. Trent got 26 months and 5 years of probation. Beverly received 14 months, suspended to probation with significant community service given her cooperation. Harold got a suspended sentence and fines. Victor, who had cooperated fully and had no prior record, received probation and was ordered to repay his earnings plus penalties. All 4 were ordered to contribute to restitution for the 5 property owners who'd been victimized. My share worked out to just over $11,000, which covered approximately my portion of the fraudulent earnings plus some of my actual damages, the utility costs, the security system installation, the lawyer's fees I'd incurred during the investigation. The cost of changing every lock in the house and having the whole property professionally cleaned before I could bring myself to spend the night there again. I want to talk about that last part, the cleaning, because it might be the thing I remember most clearly from the whole experience. I hired a professional cleaning company, the kind that does post-construction and post-vacancy work. Deep clean, every surface, every drawer, every closet. I paid for it out of pocket before the restitution came through because I couldn't wait, I needed it done. And when they were finished and I walked through my own house for the first time as genuinely mine again, I stood in the middle of my living room and didn't feel what I thought I'd feel. I thought I'd feel relieved. I felt hollow, mostly, like the rooms had been scraped of something they'd had before, and I wasn't sure what it was. I stayed that first night anyway. I slept in my own bed, in my own room. I kept waking up. I kept the cameras. I have them still. I check them every morning before I leave for a job site, and every night when I'm away. My neighbor has my number saved under a contact name she chose herself, Emergency Scott. She knows to call it for anything. She knows that nobody should be coming or going when I'm not there. The house is mine again, technically and actually, but something changed in me that I don't think fully changed back. There are evenings when I come home after a long run and I stand in the kitchen and I feel the phantom presence of strangers. I know it's psychological. I know it makes no rational sense. But I stand there sometimes and I think someone I didn't know sat right here, made their coffee right here, slept down the hall and didn't think twice about it. What I've taken away from this, after the legal process and the restitution and the trial and the slow work of reclaiming my own space, is mostly this: the vulnerability wasn't unusual. It wasn't some unique failure on my part. Thousands of people travel for work and leave their homes in the hands of trusted contractors, property managers, neighbors. Most of those people are honest, but the ones who aren't are counting on the assumption that you'll never check, that you're too far away, that you're too busy, that your trust is a locked door they already have the key to. Check your address on Airbnb and Vrbo right now if you haven't recently. Just type it in. It takes 45 seconds and it's the kind of thing you never think to do until it's too late. Put cameras in your own home, not because you're paranoid, but because documentation is the only thing that turns a civil dispute into a criminal case. Know your neighbors. Tell them specifically, nobody should be coming here when I'm gone. Give them permission to call you about anything. The call that feels intrusive might be the one that saves you. And if you hire someone, a contractor, a property manager, anyone who holds a key to your home, verify them. Not just a gut check, verify. Call references, run a background check. It's $20 and 40 minutes online, and it is absolutely worth it. Victor had been coming to my house for 3 years. I'd shaken his hand. I'd referred him to a friend once. I thought I knew who he was. I didn't know him at all. That's the thing about this kind of crime. It doesn't smash your window and grab your TV and run. It's patient. It's methodical. It uses the doors you already left open, the trust you already extended, the absence you already created by simply going to work. It moves in slowly and makes itself comfortable and waits for you to never notice. I noticed, eventually, because my neighbor took the time to send me a text. I think about that a lot, about how close I came to going the rest of that summer, coming home in November, and walking into a house that had been lived in by strangers for 7 months without ever knowing. How many 5-star reviews would have accumulated? How many people would have slept in my guest room and left the coffee maker running and said it felt just like home? It was their home. That was the whole point. Someone sold them access to my home and told them it was theirs for the weekend, and they believed it, and I was 90 minutes away on a job site, thinking my house was locked and dark and waiting for me. It's still waiting for me. It always will be. But now I know what's in it. The thing I keep coming back to isn't the money. It isn't the 11 reviews or the $9,000 Trent collected from my property, or even the 49 nights strangers slept down the hall from my bedroom. What I keep coming back to is Victor. 3 years. I'd known the man for 3 years. I'd handed him a key to my house and trusted him to check on it while I was away doing the work that paid for that house. And somewhere in that time, he'd looked at my trust and decided it was worth $400 a month to him. Not more. $400. That's what he thought my security, my privacy, my peace of mind was worth. I've thought a lot about what makes a person do that, not in an angry way anymore. I'm past the anger, mostly, but in the way you think about a puzzle you can't quite put down. And I think the honest answer is that Victor had never really developed the thing that keeps most of us from crossing certain lines. Not rules, exactly. Not fear of getting caught. Something quieter than that. The internal sense that some things belong to other people and you simply don't touch them. That a trust placed in you is something you carry carefully, not because you have to, but because that's the kind of person you've decided to be. Victor didn't have that. Maybe he never did. Maybe he lost it somewhere along the way. Either way, he looked at my house and saw an opportunity instead of a responsibility, and that choice, made quietly, without me ever knowing, set everything else in motion. What stopped it was something different. It was my neighbor taking 60 seconds to send me a text she wasn't sure she should send. It was me, sitting in a hospital break room 90 minutes away, choosing to think before I acted, choosing to document instead of confront, to build a case instead of blow it, to be patient when everything in me wanted to drive straight home and put my fist through the door. That patience wasn't natural for me. I'm not a patient man by temperament, but I understood, somewhere in that first stunned hour, that if I wanted any real outcome, not just to scare somebody off, but to actually hold them accountable, I had to think clearly and act carefully. I had to think clearly and act carefully. And then I had to follow through. For weeks, across a 7-month contract that was already demanding everything I had, I monitored those cameras, saved that footage, made those calls, showed up at that police station with a tablet full of evidence. I didn't stop when it got inconvenient. I didn't stop when Detective Osei told me it would take time. I kept going because the alternative, letting Trent and Beverly and Victor walk away from what they'd done, wasn't something I could live with, not because of the money. Because of what it meant, because some things are worth seeing through to the end, even when it costs you. I think about the couple from Virginia who almost checked in the morning of the arrests. They booked what they believed was a legitimate weekend rental and were 90 minutes out when everything changed. They were innocent, so were all the other guests. The only people in that entire operation who weren't innocent were the 3 who had made a deliberate choice at some specific moment to take something that didn't belong to them and build a business out of it. Choices are like that. They look small in the moment and enormous in the rearview mirror. My house is mine again. It took time and money and more sleepless nights than I care to count, but it's mine. And the version of me who has it back is someone who knows something now that I didn't know before. Not about security systems or rental platforms or property law, but about what I'm actually capable of when something I've built and earned and love is threatened. Turns out I'm capable of quite a lot.